Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Mm, so we'll cover the first lecture in pathology of the endocrine system. I think today we'll have a very short session. I'm going to cover only the basic when it comes to endocrine pathology. Right, so first we start off with the definition first, so that roughly we speak in similar frequency, sort of. So the endocrine glands are actually a collection of specialized cells that synthesize, store, and release their secretions, known as hormones, directly into the bloodstream. So this this is, by now you should know what you call this particular definition. So, but you need to remember that endocrine glands are well vascularized because because they need to release their hormone or their secretion, their hormones, directly into the bloodstream, in which the hormone is then transported via the blood circulation to influence the activity or functional activity of target cells, usually located in a distant organ, right, or elsewhere in the body. So therefore, endocrine diseases involve other body system with or without the involvement of the respective endocrine gland. So these are the seven major endocrine organs, although there are a few minor ones, right? The first one would be the pituitary gland, right? The pituitary gland, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, pancreas, ovaries, and the testes, which, for example, the pituitary glands, like in there are the pituitary gland. It is being divided into different parts of the pituitary gland. For example, the anterior, which responsible for secretion of the GH, the growth hormone, MSH, ACTH, TSH, LH, FSH, prolactin, and then the intermediate pituitary gland secretes MSH, and the posterior, which secretes the ADH and oxytocin. And then basically pituitary, these all of these the mentioned hormones are basically tropic hormones. And then the thyroid gland, um, um, it secretes thyroid hormones, which are responsible for the the metabolic, cardiovascular, and developmental processes in animals and human. And parathyroid secretes PTH, parathyroid hormone, functions mainly for the calcium and phosphate balance. Then again, the adrenal divided into different parts, cortex and medulla, and then the cortex is further divided into different parts, the different zones, right? The zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis, and this kind of thing. So this is just a quick recap on the major endocrine organs. So when it comes to the mechanism, you should know that alteration affecting one or several body system. For example, you may have an animal being presented with an integumentary system, but um, but the root of the problem may comes from the thyroid gland or from the adrenal gland, for example, or it may comes with nervous systems in which the main problem is actually in the pancreas, for example, in cases of hypoinsulinemia, all right, or urinary system, animal being presented with urinary system problems in which the animal may actually suffer from diabetes insipidus or diabetes mellitus, for example, right? Or skeletal system fracture the animal that could be a pathological fracture. So it is related to, for example, the abnormal function of the parathyroid gland. Okay. Right. So since when it comes to when we talk about the pathology of the endocrine glands, it is always associated with a state of either a state of hypofunction or a state of hyperfunctions, in which here hypofunctions basically means um, hypo secretions, meaning that there is less or absent secretion from a particular endocrine glands. And then on the other hand, hyperfunction here means hyper secretion, right? In which there is increased in the amount of secretion of a hormone from a particular endocrine gland. So there are about 9 or 10 different types of pathogenic mechanism pertaining to endocrine diseases. All right, so today we're gonna have a look at each one of these pathogenic mechanism of endocrine gland. So the first one is primary hypofunction of an endocrine gland. In this case, the hormonal secretion by an endocrine gland is subnormal, right? Due to the excessive destruction of the secretory cells of the endocrine gland, right? So meaning that because of the destruction of the secretory units of that particular gland itself, so that's why it is called the primary hypofunction, right? It is called primary because of the excessive destruction of the secretory cells, in which it leads to decreased secretion. That's why it is called hypofunction. So examples for this primary hypofunction of an endocrine gland may include a disease condition, improper development of the gland, or due to specific biochemical defect in hormone synthesis, in which in this case there will be lack of it results in lack of or less secretion of functional hormone. Or it can also be because of autoimmune injury leading to destruction of the secretory cells, leading to hypofunction. Or it could be because of development disturbances. So largely, eventually this will lead to the primary hypofunction of an endocrine gland. In certain cases, they can be tumor. I mean, this particular endocrine gland may suffer from may undergo tumorous or neoplastic changes, in which this tumor secrete non-functional secretion or non-functional hormones. So similarly, it will lead to primary hypofunction of an endocrine gland because the secretion is non-functional, so it cannot function like a normal hormone. All right. So these images are showing the histological picture of the of an of the adrenal gland, right? Mainly it is focusing at the cortex. So on the left side is the abnormal one, on the right side is the normal one. Um, Mainly looking at the cortex, right, from here until here, and then this is the medulla, right? M here, medulla, C, the cortex. So you should be able to appreciate that the cortex is made up of three call this three main zone or layers. The zona glomerulosa from here until here, and then fasciculata from here until here, right? And reticularis from here until here, and then next one is the medulla, similar from here until here, right? And then here until here, and then roughly here until here. All right. So looking at on the left image, you can see clearly that the zona all this fasciculata and reticularis is suffering from especially here, right, until here, very severe what do you call this vacuolar degeneration, right? So in which this particular area here uh, will secrete, most likely will secrete less hormone. So this particular animal may have less secretion of, for example, the glucocorticoid hormone. So that's the first one. Second one is the secondary hypofunction of an endocrine gland. In this type of mechanism, a disruptive lesion occur in one endocrine gland, right? And then it leads to hypofunction of um, the disruptive lesion occur in one endocrine gland. For example, the pituitary gland, right? Because in which it interferes with the secretion of the tropic hormone by the pituitary gland. So when it involves the pituitary gland, because this is the master gland, so they will always use this particular term here, the secondary. So because of the injury or destruction of the secretory units of the pituitary gland, so there will be less absent of secretion of tropic hormones by the pituitary gland. So it leads to hypofunction of the target endocrine glands. For example, adrenal gland, if you talk about ACTH from the pituitary, lack of ACTH from the pituitary gland. So it leads to secondary hypofunction or hypersecretion of the adrenal gland. Or another example would be from the thyroid gland, if you talk about the thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH from the pituitary gland. All right, or it can also be because of endocrinologically inactive tumors of the pituitary gland, which leads to no secretion or secretion of non-functional tropic hormone from the pituitary gland. All right. So this is an example of secondary hyposecretion, right, of the adrenal gland. Secondary hypofunction of the adrenal gland. In this case, the pituitary is well reddened, with a small yellowish round nodular structure at the center there, right? At the center of the pituitary. This is actually a case of pituitary adenoma, in which this adenoma secretes endocrinologically inactive or non-functional compound in which the adrenal cortex cannot recognize that, meaning that there will be leading to lack of stimulation of the adrenal cortex. So over time, with a prolonged period of time, it results in bilateral atrophy of the adrenal cortex. So that's why only the medulla is prominent, in which and then the adrenal cortex is very thin, leaving mainly the only the fibrous capsule of the adrenal cortex. And the third one is the primary hyperfunction of an endocrine gland. For this one, basically, this is the opposite of the first pathogenic mechanism. This is primary hyperfunction of an endocrine gland. In this particular mechanism, the cell of the affected gland synthesize and secrete hormone at an excessive rate, right, than normal, right, beyond the body's capacity or ability to utilize and to degrade this particular hormone. So basically, the gland produces more than what the body needs, right, to maintain homeostasis. So when it comes to endocrinology, more doesn't mean that it is good. In fact, it will lead to a loss of homeostasis. For example, right, a typical example would be a neoplasia of an endocrine gland that secretes endocrinologically active hormone, right, a functional that secretes functional hormone. Okay. For example, neoplasia of the what do you call this parathyroid gland or parathyroid chief cell adenoma, leading to excessive secretion of PTH. All right, and this would promote calcium mobilization from the bone, leading to generalized demineralization of skeleton. So the animal eventually may suffer from what we call this pathological fracture or osteodystrophia fibrosa, for example, right? Replacement of the bone by fibrous tissue. Or another example would be pancreatic beta cells adenoma, in which it leads to hyper secretion of insulin, so there will be more insulin, right? Or another name would be insulinoma, right? So where the animal may really be very weak with nervous sign and goes into coma and whatnot, right? So insulinoma is quite common in domestic cats. Okay, this is on the left side is a normal histological image of the pancreas, whereas on the right side, the image of what do you call this insulinoma, right? So you should be able to appreciate that there's very there are large what do you call this islets of Langerhans with increased number of secretory units, right? And then this particular benign tumor is well encapsulated with thick fibrous tissue. Okay. So this increased number of cells autonomously, right? They will produce insulin, okay? and basically there will be no or less negative feedback, so they will keep on producing insulin, right? Next is the secondary hyperfunction of an endocrine gland. Again, when you look at the word secondary here, I should always relate to the what do you call this? The pituitary gland. Okay, it is a lesion in one endocrine organs that leads to a long-term stimulation and hyper secretion of hormone by the target organ. Again, a good example would be a tumor of the pituitary gland, okay, that secretes functional ACTH um, at a abnormally high rate, right? Usually hyper function of the pituitary gland that leads to secretion of functional ACTH that resulted in ACTH stimulated hypertrophy and hyperplasia of the adrenal cortex, and that produce high level of cortisol. So it leads to secondary um, hypercortisolism, and then leading to other what do you call this other associated clinical signs or syndrome, including hyperpigmentation and muscular wasting. In this case, almost similar like the first one we observed, but in this case, you can see that this is another example of pituitary adenoma. But in this case, adrenal the adrenal cortex is very well thickened compared to the previous one, which was thinner. So the adrenal cortex is extremely thickened because of the prolonged stimulation by the ACTH produced from this particular pituitary adenoma until it leads to pressure atrophy um, of the adrenal medulla here. So you can see that there will be um, all this like atrophy or thinner adrenal medulla. Number 5 will be the hypersecretion of hormone or hormone-like substance by non-endocrine tumor to non-endocrine non-endocrine tumors. They may secrete peptides which are similar, which are chemically or biologically similar to the native hormone secreted by the endocrine glands. A commonly observed example would be adenocarcinoma derived from the apocrine glands. Sometimes they call it as hepatoid apocrine glands because of the histological appearance which mimics the liver, all right, the adenocarcinoma or adenoma of the apocrine glands, in which it produces hormonal substance that stimulates calcium mobilization from the bone, kidney, and intestine. So eventually, it results in persistent hypercalcemia. So in this case, it mimics hyperparathyroidism. So, but the question here, do you expect any lesions in the parathyroid gland? It depends on the duration factor. If it is a prolonged problem, then most likely you should be able to appreciate changes in the parathyroid gland, right? For example, like this, the parathyroid gland would be always smaller than normal, because their functions are being taken over by the apocrine glands. Okay, so they are they are no longer needed in this particular animal, so they undergo atrophy. Number 6 is the endocrine dysfunction due to failure of target cells to respond. In this case, there is failure of target cells to respond to hormone. So this may be due to an alteration in hormone receptors on the target cell surface, right? Whether it's polypeptide or catecholamine. But what you should know is that the target cells is no longer normal. Okay, the hormone is usually normal, but the target cell receptors is underwent changes. For example, obesity in animal and human, it decreases the number of receptors on the surface of target cells, in which results in insulin resistance or failure to respond to insulin, leading to diabetes. So in this case, the insulin is normal, but the number of receptors or the receptors itself um, are abnormal. Number 7 is the endocrine hyperactivity secondary to diseases in other organs. So there are instances in which lesions in organs other than the endocrine gland increase the activity of an endocrine gland. So for example, chronic renal failure in dogs, which resulted retention of phosphorus, which then it leads to a precipitation of phosphorus and calcium, and because of the the injury, and because of this, it leads to injury. It aggravates the injury, leading to failure of vitamin D activation, and leads to impaired calcium absorption in the intestine. So subsequently, it stimulates the parathyroid gland. So the animal, um, um, you, the animal will have syndrome associated with apa ni hyper parathyroidism. Or another example would be chronic anemia, such as due to excessive bleeding that leads to hypoxic stress and low blood oxygenation, and then in which it stimulates the production of erythropoietin. Right. Number 8 is the endocrine dysfunction resulting from abnormal degradation of hormones. Right. In this case, the secretion of hormone by an endocrine gland is actually normal. Right. However, the concentration of this particular hormone in the blood is elevated persistently due to the decrease in the rate of degradation. This actually mimics a state of hyper secretion. For example, feminization syndrome due to hyper estrogenism as a result of cirrhosis and failure in the hepatic degradation of estrogen. But anyway, and then another example would be hyperthyroidism in patients with renal failure as a result of failure of kidneys to degrade PTH. Although time to time we do observe on this liver cirrhosis as well as chronic kidney disease in animals, but we so far it's very rare for us to to obtain to have complaint pertaining to this particular pathogenic mechanism of endocrine dysfunction. Right. So this is I think this is less important so far, as far as from our practice. Number 9 is the iatrogenic syndrome of hormone excess. So the administration of hormone or hormone-like substances either directly or indirectly influences the activity of target cell. So usually this occur because of part of treatment of various of different diseases. For example, prolonged treatment of various diseases using adrenal corticosteroid, which leads to muscular weakness, hair loss, mineral deposition in the skin, or it could also lead to diabetes mellitus. For example, the use of dexamethasone as a what do you call this anti-inflammatory drug, or prolonged intake on plant containing estrogen-like substance leading to sexual hyperactivity and endometrial hyperplasia in cows and infertility in quail. So in this case, this is example for the first example prolonged treatment using dexamethasone for a different variation of corticosteroids. So again, on the right side is the normal adrenal gland, and the left side is the abnormal adrenal gland. So because of the prolonged treatment using glucocorticoid, so eventually it leads to atrophy, shrinkage of the zona vasculata. Then it leads to so because of the shrinkage, it leads to the thickening of the capsule of the adrenal gland. So at higher magnification, can be difficult to appreciate the but in the call this in the adrenal cortex, only roughly 2 zones or 2 layers are observable, right? The zona glomerulosa and the zona reticularis. So because of the atrophy of cells in the zona vasculata, because its function is being taken over by the treatment using glucocorticoid. So far, do you have any question regarding the what do you call this pathogenic, regarding today's session, especially the mechanism when it comes to endocrine pathology?
No, sir. No.
Tak ada, right? Which is good. It's either you understand or difficult to understand. But anyway, you just need to maybe go back and have another look. But really, it's quite simple. Just based on the important one would be the primary hyperfunction of the endocrine gland, secondary hyperfunction, primary hyperfunction, and secondary hyperfunction. These four are perhaps the most important when it comes to the pathogenic mechanism of endocrine pathology. So usually I will only cover this particular section during the first lecture. So that I want you to have some time to have a look at all 9 mechanisms before we proceed to have a look at each particular endocrine gland. So I'm going to end our session here. So I'll see you the next session. Hari apa? Well, when is the next class? Wednesday. All right. So I'll see you on Wednesday.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right.
Have a nice day, doctor.
Thank you, doctor.
Nice.